Thank you for having me tonight. I am a fill-in, as you may have heard. So I had about 4 days notice to present here tonight. So if anything's bad, that's my excuse. But this talk I have actually given to several other chapters. And so fortunately, it was very easy for me to pull it off. It also is a subject near and dear to my heart, as I've been working on purple martins for quite some time. So we'll launch into it. I thank my friend Lisa Alvarez, who took a number of the photos here as we go through. I thought I would just give you a little background on myself. I know that's probably not as interesting as the birds, but regardless, I am a wildlife biologist certified by the Wildlife Society, and I'm currently an independent researcher and conservation planner, retired, but still working in research and conservation. I've been working on birds and natural resource conservation in Northern California for about 43 years now. And I began working on purple martins way back in 1991 and almost continuously since then. I've worked extensively with martins throughout Northern California and also have had a chance to do limited work in Arizona and at least seen the eastern martin in also worked in the state of Washington, and then also a little bit of observation in the eastern US. So I thought I would start with a little introduction to the species. The purple martin is the largest North American swallow, does have a number of relatives in Central and South America. It is abundant and particularly well studied in the East. But is much less common in Western North America. It is, of course, a cavity nester. That's why it uses those birdhouses. And that makes it susceptible to loss of nest sites and to nest site competition from European starlings and house sparrows. They are colonial nesters. They nest in groups together. They are, of course, an aerial insectivore. All their food is taken on the wing, insects taken on the wing, and that makes them particularly susceptible to things like pesticides that we'll talk about as we go along here. Another just kind of interesting fun fact is that the adult plumage is acquired in a delayed fashion in the male. And so the male, which is what this bird is at the bottom here, looks superficially like a female in its second year, and then in its third year, that is when it's 2 years old, going into its third year, it molts into the familiar, blackish, so-called purple coloration. This you can tell is an immature male because of the all dark head, the scattering of purple feathers in the breast, and they also sing and act like males. So this is the breeding distribution of the purple martin in North America, all different subspecies. And as you can see, a lot of concentration in the south and along the eastern seaboard, but extending well up into Canada. They are primarily a result of nest boxes. I'm sorry, I thought I had a different slide. Well, let's go over the three subspecies. So we have the eastern martin, which occurs in eastern North America and winters in the Amazon. And that subspecies is abundant, but gradually declining over time. And there's a lot of investigation as to why that is. The Sonoran Desert, the southwestern martin occurs in the Sonoran Desert, where they nest almost exclusively in saguaro cactus, in woodpecker holes. Their winter range is actually unknown, although again, research is underway to try to determine that. The species appears to be moderately abundant, but the trend is unknown. And certainly there's some decline in habitat from development of desert lands and from invasion of non-native grasses that are promoting fire that is killing the saguaros in some areas. And then finally, we have the western purple martin that is occurs in the Pacific and montane West the subspecies arboricola winters in a different location than all the other martins in the Atlantic coastal forest, which of course is a biodiversity hotspot in Brazil. And this population is low and declining or stable in various parts of its range, which I'll cover in a little more detail here. So this shows you the distribution of the Western purple martin. It is in the Rockies and in the Intermountain region. Those are all the same subspecies. It extends down into Baja California in the montane areas, and then along the Pacific coast up to British Columbia. This is the Southwest martin here, and all of this are Eastern martins. So what are some of the differences between Western martins and the Eastern martin? Well, first, they're genetically distinct using DNA hybridization techniques, I think it is. They've determined that the species mostly separated from one another about 200,000 years ago. They are much less abundant. We estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7,000 martins occupying the entire range in the West versus an estimate that's been made of about 12 million in the East. The plumage is lighter in the female and in the second year birds in the West than in the East, noticeably different. Our birds are slightly larger. I think it's about 3% larger in body mass and dimensions. And then, of course, they have different nest sites. Our Western birds do not use apartment-style housing. They're nesting in a variety of different nest sites. The Eastern birds are, believe it or not, 100% dependent on backyard supplied nest boxes. They've completely made the change away from their natural nesting habitat. Well, we're kind of boring in a little bit in more detail and looking at the use of nest sites within the population or areas occupied by the Western martin. And as you can see here, the British Columbia population, which we almost lost, it was down to about 20 pairs in the province, rebounded as a result of nest boxes. And it's now 100% dependent on nest boxes. I think there's been one instance recently of a pair nesting in a tree. In Washington, it's about 90% boxes, again, recovery, and about 10% natural snags. In Oregon, it's about 50-50. Here in California, we have almost no nest box use. We know of two sites, one in Napa and one in Humboldt County, that I erected with my colleagues, where birds have taken up in nest boxes. And the rest of the birds are either in snags or in bridges, which we'll talk about again in some detail as we proceed. Elsewhere in the West, it's all snags. So let's focus in on the Western purple martin in California. This species was formerly, or subspecies, was formerly considered locally common. Grinnell and Miller, the experts on birds of California in the 1940s, characterized it that way. And throughout the state, it was locally common, except in the deserts and the high mountain region. The range had actually expanded as the martins learned to colonize buildings. So most of the buildings in the northern and central portion of the Central Valley had martin populations nesting in them, like Colusa, Chico, Auburn, Oroville, Sacramento, but noticeably not down into the main part of the the San Joaquin Valley. So they colonized these buildings, and numbers of birds were building up. But unfortunately, in the 1960s, when the European starling arrived as a breeder in California, the non-native species, obviously, the range and abundance of the purple martin was greatly reduced. And now the species is highly localized, except along the forested areas of the North Coast. This shows you the current breeding distribution of the purple martin in California from eBird records, as you can see, over a 4-year period. And the first point is that this map actually suggests greater abundance than actually occurs. I mean, there may be one or two pairs nesting in this site, but eBird makes it, a big box. But nonetheless, what you see again is localized distribution, except to some degree on the Central Coast. Again, the connection is exaggerated there, and more extensively on the North Coast. Otherwise, very scattered distribution. They have been mostly eliminated in the Cascades, the Sierra Nevada, the Central Valley, and much of Southern California, the lowland areas in particular. So what do we know about the population status and trend in the state? First, I have to say not enough. There has been no comprehensive population surveys done for the species, which is unfortunate, maybe somewhat understandable because it's a difficult species to survey. The historical records on where martins occurred and what numbers was thoroughly summarized by Brian Williams as a part of his master's thesis back in the 1980s. So that gave us kind of a baseline, excuse me, a baseline to work from. The bird species of special concern account that Brian and I prepared in was finally released in 2008, but it was up to date as of about 2004. And based on the amount of habitat and some kind of eyeballing, we made an estimate of about 1,300 to 1,800 nesting pairs occurring in the state. The last source of information was the 2009 assessment of status that I conducted in Northern California, which I'll talk some about. So, other than these things, there are a few localized long-term or periodic monitoring at a few sites over the period since starlings established and really became widespread and abundant in the state. And so I'm going to give you this information about my 2009 status assessment in Northern California, even though it's old, because it is pretty much what we know. And it also could serve as the baseline for an up-to-date status assessment, at least within this region. The goals of this study were to evaluate abundance at sites where we had, or evaluate changes in abundance at sites where we had adequate historical information on abundance, which unfortunately was very few. And at the other sites, we just were assessing occupancy. Our sites that were occupied in the past, still occupied as of 2009. The study areas that we looked at included 45 sites in 15 different Northern California counties. 42 of those sites had been previously occupied. In other words, we went there because they had been reported to support martins in the 1960s through the 80s, but in particular in the 80s, because we wanted to see what changes had happened since the starling arrival. This shows you the types of nest sites that we observed and went back to. 21 in bridges, 18 in snags, and then a scattering of other sites. Now, bridges are overrepresented, probably, well, they're certainly overrepresented relative to the proportion of types of sites used by the species throughout the state. And the reason for that is they're easy to find. The snags that were there 20 years ago may be completely gone, or the description of where those snags were was incomplete before GPS and such. So we couldn't be sure that we were going back to the same sites in many cases. But bridge, where a bridge is, it's still there. Anyway, so these are the 4 sites. These are the trends, if you will, at only the 4 sites where we had this long-term population monitoring. At Shasta Lake, these are flooded snags within the lake. The population, even though the data were pretty spread out, the population seems to have remained pretty stable. We had one site that just had a few years of data. There's more, but unfortunately, the person that collected it is uncooperative, let's just say. And so I don't have that data. What it suggests is, at least over this period, that the site was relatively stable. Another site we had was the Gualala River, which actually was a breeding bird survey route, where one point was at the river and the birds were nesting in the bridge over the river. And you can see the numbers there. Those are 5-year averages, because there's so much fluctuation, just due to the fact that the surveyors only spent 3 minutes there as part of the survey protocol. But you can see a decline and some recovery, so variable. And then I'm going to talk in detail about the Sacramento population, which has declined dramatically. If you look, rather than at numbers of birds, but just at persistence, what sites that we resurveyed between the 1990s and 2009, what percentage of those sites were still occupied? It runs variably, but generally up to about 58% of the sites are still occupied. The remainder have been lost. If you look at it by substrate, about 70% of those in trees and snags were lost. The numbers in bridges, permanent sites, buildings, utilities, and such was 44%, which is kind of alarming, because those sites are more stable. But nothing is ever a simple answer in biology, and to some degree, these losses, particularly on the Central Coast, were due to the fact that the bridges had become overgrown. So when they constructed the bridges, they cleared all the riparian vegetation, the willows, the cottonwoods, the alders growing next to the bridge, which made it open and made the bridge accessible. Those became overgrown over time to the point where they are not as suitable because they're not as accessible. The overall loss, about 3% of sites per year. So concerning. There's some more recent indicators of population status, but these are sort of, as I say, fragmentary and incidental, but it's basically all we have except at very localized sites, primarily Sacramento. So the positive indicators are, we did get a second nest box colony established in Napa County. Somebody who put up boxes 10 years, well, more like 12 years ago. 2 years ago, the birds finally started using the boxes. And when we added more boxes, they began occupying those as well. So that colony appears to be thriving, which is really good news. I did a partial resurvey last year of 7 sites in coastal Mendocino County that held, I think, about 80 birds amongst them. And all of those sites remained occupied, except, and one site that actually had been lost since the 60s, when it was surveyed in 2009, became reoccupied. So that was encouraging. We've seen some small increases in numbers in Santa Clara and San Mateo County, up on tops of the mountains there in the Coast Range, but it's a little unclear whether those are real increases or just people have finally found the colonies and are paying more attention. Unfortunately, there are indicators of that are negative in terms of population status. A wonderful population at the Lava Beds National Monument that was reported over 100 years ago, where birds were actually flying underground into these lava tubes that you see here, these tunnels that are created by flowing lava. And they were nesting in there in a number of those different tubes. They have disappeared, unfortunately, within the last 6 to 8 years. Another indicator that was disappointing is I was hoping that all these wildfires that we get creates open habitat and abundant nest sites in snags. And we were hoping that purple martins would reoccupy or occupy some of those areas. But surveys that were done for the blackback woodpecker have shown only 3 of 133 sites that were burned as of several years ago have been occupied by martins. Now I have to say that the range of the purple martin generally is lower elevation than the blackback woodpecker. So this may be somewhat of a biased sample, and there may be a few more. We know of a few nesting sites in burned areas, certainly, but there doesn't appear to be a widespread increase in response to fire, unfortunately. And then the other recent indication, which I'm going to go into in detail, is the continued decline until very recently of the purple martin in the bridges of Sacramento. So conclusions regarding the statewide status. The species has substantially declined or been extirpated from most areas of the Central Valley, except Sacramento, the Sierra Nevada, the Bay Area, and with few exceptions, and lowland Southern California. I will just mention that one pair colonized the East Bay for the first time that they have nested there in over 15 years. So that is another recent hopeful sign, but you know, young birds that colonize new areas come and go. So there's nothing guaranteed that that's going to persist. The Central Coast, the status is a little uncertain. We're biased toward bridge colonies there, and there are birds nesting in the redwood trees. The bridge colonies have declined, but at least some areas where the trees, they're using trees, the population appears to be stable. And then on the North Coast, the species appears to be relatively abundant and relatively stable. This is based on limited data. And you might ask, well, why are there these differences among these different regions? And the primary ones, I believe, are starling abundance and perhaps insecticide use. Starlings do not, like open areas, urban areas, grazed pastures, agricultural fields. And so areas that tend to support those kinds of habitats have lots of starlings and thus lots of nest competitors. I don't think it's a coincidence that the birds are doing well on the North Coast, where those habitats are relatively rare. Most of the areas are forested, redwoods, Douglas fir forest, and such. The insecticide issue I'll talk about with respect to Sacramento in a few minutes here. It does raise an interesting question when you have this pattern of decline regarding what does this mean in terms of the Endangered Species Act? The endangered, these are not even a species in California, they're a subspecies of a larger species. Well, subspecies are defined as species under the Endangered Species Act. So if the subspecies is endangered, biologically, then it is eligible for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act. The Act also recognizes distinct population segments of subspecies as being listable if those distinct segments have declined. And that probably fits the definition of what's going on with purple martins. We have one area where things are good, but most of the range, the population has dramatically declined or been extirpated. Anyway, there doesn't seem to be much appetite amongst the agencies to find out what the status is, something I've been advocating for many years, nor does anyone seem terribly ready to pick up the cudgel and suggest listing for the species. But we're in kind of a catch-22. We don't have the data to promote listing, and we don't have listing because we don't have data. And the money tends to go to listed species, not unlisted species. Okay, end of tirade on that subject. I'm going to turn now to a more focused study that I've been working on, as I said, since the 1990s on the purple martin nesting population in urban Sacramento. And we're going to start with a little bit of a history lesson. This is Sacramento at Old Town on the Sacramento River, depicted, I think, in the 1870s or 60s. Before 1859, or even 1849, purple martins nested in snags, presumably in the Central Valley. But obviously, we don't have any record of that. Very interesting to me is that martins were reported using buildings in Sacramento as early as 1876 by Robert Ridgway, who was probably the foremost ornithologist of his era. And he did some surveys for the railroad that once started in Sacramento. And he was recording birds nesting in buildings, 150 years ago. This is where they nested. And over this period from the 1850s to the 1960s, birds occupied primarily tile roof buildings, but any building that had a niche that they could use that was, superficially similar to a woodpecker hole, which is what, they would be using in a natural condition. As I said before, I think the population was probably increasing due to this building use through the 1940s, according to Grinnell and Miller. But unfortunately, in the early 70s, fortunately, in the 1970s, martins adopted nesting in bridges in Sacramento. The undersides of these elevated freeways that have been constructed through the city, I refer to them as bridges. The birds came in and used a couple of these sites before the starling arrived in the 1970s and promptly outcompeted martins from buildings over the next decade. This is very well documented by records kept by Sacramento Audubon from their trips and reportings, kind of a paper version of eBird that was kept for over 50 years by a fabulous woman with Sacramento Audubon. Let's see, the entire Central Valley population was eliminated over this period of the 1970s and 80s, except in Sacramento, where the birds were only nesting in these bridge structures. So not only were they eking by, but the population was healthy and was increasing up until about 2004. And I was studying this population and thought, oh, this is interesting. And, I'll do this for a year or two. And unfortunately, this is what happened after 2004. So we do annual surveys. We count every nesting pair by going in and mapping the use of these holes and identifying the behavior of birds carrying nesting material, food, hearing, calling young. So we have a census. It's an absolute count. It's not a sample or an estimate. And this is what has happened since 2004. Back in the 1990s, the population was probably as high or higher than this, but we didn't have complete surveys. This is where we have complete surveys. And as you can see, there was a steep decline from 2004 to 2008. Things leveled off a little bit, declined again, leveled off a little bit, declined again, and now things are kind of bouncing around at this very low level. The 2002 numbers, which are not on the graph, were 22 pairs. So we're down in this area right around 20 to 25 pairs. The number of colony sites over this period has declined from 12 to 5. As I think I said, an overall 88% decline on the population. We had single colonies with 30, 40 birds nesting there. 30 pairs nesting there. So 60 birds, which is 3 times more than the entire population that is left. And the declines have occurred across all the colony sites. It's not that certain sites got impacted by something specific, which I'll talk about in more detail. One of the things that we've done in our studies is try to identify, well, what are the key habitat components that determine where the birds are, and trying to answer the question of why have they declined. They need an insect food supply. Again, aerial insectivores. There've got to be insects around. Dragonflies in particular are the species times its breeding period so that it is feeding young when the dragonfly population in the summertime is at its peak. They need these bridge nesting sites, and they need adequate airspace and flight access to these sites. So trees that obstruct, building stuff underneath there makes the sites unsuitable. They also have to have nesting material sources, somewhere where they can get sticks, grasses, other things that they carry to the nest site, which is a part of the breeding cycle and the ritual amongst the pair. And they often use perch sites like these where they can defend their nest, they can display male and female and such. So those are really the 5 key things that we look for. And we've been able to map areas that identify that have those characteristics and survey them. So we are very confident that we're surveying all the suitable sites and have a complete number. We've also instituted a number of management actions, including installing these little wire inserts that we call nest guards into the holes. And the idea here is that we were getting fallouts of nests of young from these holes because they lean over. It's this is a vertical cylinder going up into the bridge, and they lean over the edges waiting for mom and dad to arrive with food. And sometimes they tumble out, they jostle each other. And so this nest guard creates a little railing for them. They can safely lean over the edge, and it has been effective at reducing the incidence of fallout. We rehabilitate nestling fallouts. We've installed perch wires and nest boxes. The perch wires have been very effective in certain areas at attracting birds or replacing perches that have been removed. The nest boxes remain unused in the Sacramento area, unfortunately. We've managed vegetation to prevent obstruction of access. We provide it's really me, provides nesting material and calcium that they can use to form eggs and to feed to young for their development of their skeletons. And we have contemplated, but not actually done any predator nesting habitat management. We've had some issues with kestrels taking our birds. And we've attempted to find the nest sites to close them off, but we've not been successful in doing so far. And the situation seems to have abated. So why is the population declining? Well, at the most basic level, a population declines when either reproduction and recruitment to the adult population is lower than the mortality rate. Fewer births than deaths. That's a decline. But so it occurs when either reproduction is abnormally low, or adult or juvenile survival is abnormally low, too many deaths, or both are happening at the same time. And at the risk of causing everybody to turn off their Zoom, we can sort of describe that process that through a population equation, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. I'm going to give you the English version. And it's very simple. It says the population next year, not net year, next year, equals the number of adults that were present this year that survive to the next year, plus the number of young that are produced this year that survive to the next year, the recruits, the ones that come back. And what we can do with this population model is solve it to identify what factors may be causing the decline. We know the population size, so we know what the end result is as things change from year to year. We also know the adult survival rate, or we did during certain periods where we did very intense color banding of these birds, and we used resighting to identify what the survival rate of adults were. So we can use the model to calculate, well, what is the reproductive rate or the juvenile survival rate that would have to have occurred to produce or result in the next year's population that we observed. So that all sounds probably pretty confusing, and this may make it more so, but hopefully it'll clarify it. This shows you the period. If you remember from that graph, we had the sharpest decline during this period of 2006 to 2009. The population declined by 50% over just 4 years. During that period, we had our color banding, and we knew that about 58% of the adults survived from year to year. Well, we can plug those numbers into the equation. And if we say, well, let's assume the juvenile survival rate is the same as in other populations, just for modeling purposes, what is the reproductive rate that would have to have occurred in order to result in the next year's population? So in this instance, 141 pairs, 58% of the adults from that population survived. We recruited 32% of the juveniles that were fledged. How many fledglings had to occur? And as you can see, the average here is about 1.6 fledglings per year. Well, that number is about half of what healthy populations of purple martins generally produce. Now, we held this one constant. So what we can say with some certainty is, and I should have mentioned that this adult population survival is a little bit low. It's more like about 65% in other populations. So survival is slightly low. But the reproduction and the first year survival is very low. One or the two of those unknowns that we can't tease apart. So, but nonetheless, this shows strong evidence that low reproduction and recruitment is the cause of our decline in Sacramento, or at least was during this period of rapid decline. Well, we can also take those figures of declines and we can extrapolate to say, when are we going to run out of martins? You know, we can project using past rates of decline. We can project forward to say, how long is it going to be until we lose this population? And of course, it depends on what period of time you select. And so I'm just showing you some different timelines here, different time periods, and the average annual rate of decline for those different periods. If you take the entire 16 years, the average rate of decline was 12%, and we will have declined to 3 pairs of martins within 11 years. And we consider 3 pairs of martins to be the extirpation point when all is lost, because all of our colonies show that pattern, that when a colony drops to 3 pairs, it almost invariably disappears. And in our case, the birds get sucked up into another colony. But when there's only 3, you're essentially out of business as a martin colony. So you can look at these different timelines and you can see there's some that are more optimistic. If you use the last 5 years, this was done in 2019, it could be 31 years. Well, that's pretty reassuring. But we had some very low, very high rates of decline in recent years up until 2019. And then from 2019 to 2022, this is one I just added today, the population has it's basically stayed stable. It's increased by 1%. And so it may be that one of these declines is going to occur and we're going to lose the population, or if this 4-year period, if the rate of change remains stable on into the future, we will never lose the species. We'll just have, 20, 25 pairs. Again, an 88% decline from its high. So I covered that. So then the question is, well, what's causing poor reproduction and the decline? Looking at all these factors, and we basically looked at a number of potential causes. And the first set are those that you might initially think could be a problem, but we've determined that they really have almost no effect. Surprisingly, competition with starlings, as well as with swifts and other species that nest in these bridges, is not an issue. And the reason is particularly with starlings, they nest earlier, they choose their nest sites. There's an abundance of these holes. You know, many of these sites have literally hundreds of holes available. So the starlings choose theirs, the martins come back and they choose theirs, and there's no need to fight. The swifts and the rough-winged swallows are smaller, and the martins are dominant. So not an issue. General human disturbance, no real evidence. The birds are very tolerant of humans, as they're known to be throughout their range. In some cases, they moved into areas with more human activities because there were perch sites and other things they liked. Climate change, well, that would make sense, because you would think that that's something that could affect all of the various colonies where declines occurred. But when we went and looked at the data, this shows you the average monthly temperatures during the period of the decline and recently. And, or I should say, this is the period before the decline. And surprisingly, during this period of April to July, the nesting period, the temperatures have not changed. I'm certain that if we map this out in August, September, October, and November, there would be changes. It's hotter here, I know it is. But during the martin season, it's not. And actually, April is a little bit warmer now, which is a good thing, because 60 degrees is a temperature where insects are not very active. So if anything, climate change would be contributing to an increase. And we've also seen no change in the timing of nesting activities, which is sometimes a response to climate change. So what other potential causes? Well, some we know are important, but they're localized. They only occur at one or a few colonies. Vehicle collisions, feral cat predation. We had an incident with feral cat predation, but we took care of it. It was only at one site. We got the cats removed. Kestrel predation has been a problem for us at several sites. It has died out over the last couple of years, thankfully, probably because their habitat was modified by development, surprisingly. Construction disturbance is something that occurs and does cause problems for martins that we've documented, but it tends to be localized. It wouldn't explain a widespread decline that we have seen. So these are contributors, but they're not the primary cause. Then you have those things that are widespread, but they really have sort of limited effects. And the nestling fallout situation may represent that to some degree. We have already addressed that at 2 of the 5 colonies by putting in these nest guard inserts. And as you can see from the results here, the number of fallouts per nest is relatively low, even when you do not have the nest guards. The nest guards work. They reduce the incidence by 1/3 or more, by 75%. But we're still only losing about 1 bird per 3 nests, which doesn't seem enough to drive a decline. Okay, so finally, and this took me 10 years, to figure this out, but what is the effect the only cause that is consistent with the results that we have seen, and that is the effect of neonicotinoid pesticides. These are the pesticides that are implicated in the honeybee decline and in declines of other insectivores, especially aerial insectivores. And the way this works, obviously, is due to a reduction in insect prey, which to some degree reduces adult survival, but also appears to be substantially reducing reproduction. I should mention reproduction is hard to assess up in 30, 40 feet high inside of a dark bridge. This graph here shows you the changes in the amounts of the 5 different major neonicotinoid pesticides between the 1990s and 2017. And as you can see, there's a dramatic increase exactly during the period when we lost the bulk of our purple martin population. You want to go a little closer in, this is the pattern of neonicotinoid use. which is very well documented by the Department of Food and Agriculture during this period. And again, during 2006 to 2010, you see dramatic increase in use, which is when the birds decline. So how does that affect insect populations? Well, there are almost no studies that are long-term that have looked at the abundance of insects in the Central Valley. But there's one, and that is one on butterflies that Art Shapiro from UC Davis has been conducting continuously for, I think, 60 years. This graph here shows you the number of butterfly species, Lepidoptera species, seen on these 4 survey routes in the Central Valley over time. And what you see here is population, I should say the diversity of species was pretty stable up until about the late 1990s, early 2000s, and then it dropped off dramatically. If you look at the number of species observed versus the amounts of neonicotinoids used, dramatic drop off as the neonicotinoids use increased. So this pretty much shows you what's happening. It's circumstantial, but it's strongly circumstantial. And here's what my population looks like in the number of nesting pairs in relation to the amount of neonicotinoids applied. So this graph starts at 2003, 2004, 2005, and continues on through to 2016. And what you see again is interestingly, is a very sharp decline at relatively low uses of neonicotinoids after they were introduced, and then a continued gradual decline. I suspect that this population here is dependent on insects that are hatched from vernal pools, roadside ditches that are not connected to urban waterways where there's a lot of neonicotinoid use. Probably many of you are using it in your gardens, perhaps without knowing it, and also in agricultural, drainage ditches, ponds, that sort of thing. So apparently they're relying on the remaining areas that are not impacted. Okay, I'm probably going on a little long here, and let me just finish up by talking a little bit about land use impacts. There are many challenges of having a population that is breeding in the urban environment. And most of them that martins face are due to inadequate planning, environmental analysis, design, and construction of projects. And I can give you numerous examples that have occurred in the Sacramento region. A current active threat is a lane addition to the Highway 50, where they blocked off all of the holes in nesting colonies, as I say, to protect the construction from birds, not to protect birds from construction. We had them remove these at the colony sites, and the birds have continued nesting, but only because I asked, not because any environmental document identified it. So the conservation goal for this component of this threat is to protect the purple martins from impacts of land uses, the short-term impacts of land uses, until pesticide uses can be resolved, which is moving at a glacial pace. We had a big setback this week in terms of EPA denying the use of, or continuing to allow the use of neonicotinoids as a seed treatment on crop seeds. So what conservation actions can we engage in? We need to address long-term issues, ban or greatly reduce the use of neonicotinoids, conduct a statewide status reassessment so we know where we stand in the state and we can promote protection and management, conduct proper land use planning and project implementation, which has been very sketchy up until maybe just the last year or two. A number of mitigation measures that I won't go into here were adopted for the I Street Bridge, but that project is stalled, and the mitigations which would be useful, such as trying a new style of nest box, have been thwarted. And those measures include awareness training for planners, city planners and biologists, certification of biologists, installing nest guards, other things. And then finally, preparing a comprehensive conservation plan for the city of Sacramento for its land use. And I recommended this measure and it was rejected. So I just did it myself anyway. And I wrote this book, which is a comprehensive document. It summarizes the history, ecology, and population status of purple martins, their habitat needs, available management actions, conservation priorities, and most importantly, very specific land use planning guidelines that need to be adhered to and applied for projects near colonies. And this includes very site-specific information on what martins need in their colony areas, including, for example, here, what are the routes that they access? Where is the nest site? What are the routes they use to access it? Where do they perch? Where do they collect nesting material? And without this information, you can disrupt one of these features and make the site unsuitable. So I produced this book. It was published in the fall of 2020. It's designed, both as a conservation plan and as kind of a research summary. It also includes monitoring protocols. And the book is available from the Central Valley Bird Club, which published it and is selling it on their website. So if you are interested in getting more information about martins in Sacramento, very specific population, but lots and lots of information, such as I presented here, but in more detail, you can get it there. So what are the future of Sacramento colonies? They're going to continue to decline, but the decline is slowing, and maybe they will remain at this low population level. The presumed cause is insecticide effects on food supply. I should note that new threats are constantly emerging and sometimes are unexpected. We have homeless people camping under some of these sites, and we had a huge fire. The entire encampment went up in flames. Fortunately, there was nothing fortunate about it, but it did occur in August. And the birds were already gone, migrating back to Brazil. So it didn't cause a problem. But if it had been 2 months earlier, we would have lost all those birds probably. We have tried all the conservation measures that we can think of. And it is quite possible that extirpation could occur within 10 to 30 years. So at this point, we'll continue to monitor and protect habitat in land use projects, but there's really no other active management contemplated. And we really need a broader campaign to address insecticides to get a meaningful handle on this population, as well as others that are being affected, not just of martins, but of other aerial insecticides. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. As this says, we need, we're just paying attention to martins. People are not paying as much attention to other insectivores. We may not be able to save the Sacramento purple martin, but we're going to try. And if we lose it, at least it will serve as a signal that our society decided to allow this to happen, and maybe it will motivate us to prevent that from happening to other species. So with that, I will thank you, and I apologize if I went on too long, Rachel, and if we still have time for questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that very informative yet very sobering presentation. Doesn't look like we have any questions yet. Let me just pop into the chat box here. Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions yet, but I'm sure I can't imagine that no one has any questions. So for anyone who has any questions, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat box. There was so much information in this presentation.
You're probably all numb with overkill, but 30 years of work into 50 minutes of presentation, I guess, is the problem anyway.
Yeah, that's a lot to condense for sure. Okay, let me check again. Let's see here.
Yeah, I mean, maybe while I'm waiting, I could just talk a little bit about the Fresno
Okay.
region. There are a few colonies up in the central and southern Sierra that you can see on eBird, but nothing down in the valley itself. There's also one very odd colony that nests in a utility structure in Tulare County in the foothills, which is very surprising. There's about actually two utility structures, and there's about 4 pairs nesting there. Very odd, very unusual.
Oh, wow. I've seen 1 pair in the Central Sierra one time. And yeah, that took me by surprise. But that was a chance encounter. Only happened to me one time. As much
Well,
time as I
and you will see them coming through in migration, usually in August. There's a greater array of sightings because birds are coming all the way from British Columbia and moving down. We did have a bird banded on the Columbia River that passed through one of our colony sites and only stayed a day, but they were moving through the valley. We were able to document where that bird came from.
All right, well, we have now we have 3 comments in the chat box. Well, actually, it's 1 comment and 2 questions. The comment comes from Nancy Greaser, and she says, excellent presentation, well presented and documented, and thank you. Then she poses a question, which is, who maintains all the houses built for the birds?
Well, primarily it is people like you, volunteers. It is a huge thing in the eastern US where generations of people, have backyard martin colonies, and they spend lots of money and lots of time taking care of their martins. There's a whole association, a nonprofit organization, the Purple Martin Conservation Association, which is dedicated to martin management, and they sell all the gear, thousands of dollars in poles, pulleys that you raise and lower the nest boxes so that you can check the nests, and huge amount of technology developed solely around this one species. And that's why they're doing really well there for the most part. But there is a problem with, greater urbanization of populations. People, a lot of the people in the hobby are older people. Out here in the West, it's really very few individuals. The Puget Sound probably has, 30 colonies managed by 10 or 15 people. And that's almost the entire population. In British Columbia, they have probably 40 of these so-called landlords, and they're supporting all of the birds on Vancouver Island, which is the only place that they're nesting at this point.
Okay, so we have another, thank you, Dan. We have another question, and this one is from Robert. And the question is, I have seen them while houseboating on the Delta. Where might they be nesting?
Well, not nearby. Those birds would either have to be in migration. Well, they'd have to be in migration either north or south. We're pretty confident, that if birds were nesting in the Delta, we would have seen them. So they could be my birds coming back in. We had a report of 3 birds last year. This year in May in the Lodi region. And we ran down there really excited, thinking we were going to see birds. Maybe they'd be nesting in a snag, and they were gone. They were just moving through. So that's what I would expect there. I'd love to be proven wrong, however. So if you find a pair, don't be afraid. If you find a nesting pair, don't be afraid to bring it up. I won't ridicule you.
Well, thank you, Dan. We have the next question, which comes from Judy Johnson, and she asks, I have seen northern rough-winged swallows use similar bridge holes in the Fresno area. Is there any possible competition with swallows?
There is, but the rough-winged swallow is on the bad end of that competition. We've looked at this in Sacramento. I actually published a little paper on it, and what you find is you have the martins like to occupy longer structures. They have to be at least 70 meters long or 250 feet long because it's a big bird and they fly, circle around underneath the colony. So they need space. So in those areas, the ruffling swallows will nest, but they are restricted to the abutments, the edges of those bridge or overpass structures where martins don't have access, because ruffling swallows are smaller. They're very maneuverable. They fly kind of bat-like, so they can get into tighter spaces. When we looked at so they are restricted at martin colonies to the very edges. We looked at other overpasses, and where martins are not present, the rufflings will occupy the entire structure. They'll choose holes any old place. So it's pretty clear that in those areas where martins are, they exclude rufflings from the areas where they're nesting. And so there's no detrimental effect on martins. And there's so few sites occupied by martins, there's really no meaningful effect on ruffling swallows as well.
Okay, and that seems to be it for now for the questions. So I'm going to give it just another moment for anyone to weigh in with their comments or their questions. And if no one else does, then I'll go ahead and wind this down, but I'll just give it a few seconds here to see if anyone else has anything they want to say or ask.
I see my friend Barry Bolton has a hand up. I don't know if he wants to speak, but do you see that?
Yes, I would like to make a comment and ask a question, if I may, Dan. A really interesting presentation. Thank you very much. But my question is this. You mentioned that in the eastern US, there are pretty enormous quantities. I think you mentioned 12 million purple martins. Over here, we have a very small number, and they're not doing very well. I mean, is there any reason to suppose that we should expect to see this particular species survive here? It seems to me, from what you've been saying, that it's not a very competitive species. Why would we indeed be concerned about it, given that it's doing very well apparently in the east? I mean, do we expect every species to be in every place? It seems unlikely to me that we would expect that.
Well, there are several components to that. I guess that question. I mean, one is, why should we care? And I would argue that maintaining species distribution throughout their range in and of itself is important. Secondly, these are distinct subspecies. They've been separated, their genetics are different. They've been separated from the eastern martins for 200,000 years. It's a unique life form, even though it has not been officially classified as a separate species. And protecting biodiversity is not just about protecting species, it's about protecting the full component of the genetic makeup of species, so that they have the ability to adapt, to continue to thrive. Another component of what I think I heard from you, Barry, is, why are they so uncommon here? And maybe they're just not suited. It's probably a function of aridity and insect abundance, naturally, that led to lower populations. This is a much more arid environment without rain in the summertime in our Mediterranean climate compared to the eastern US. So that's part of why even naturally the birds are localized in their distribution. But I know I don't subscribe to the idea that, oh, well, they're doing fine in the eastern US, so we shouldn't really have to worry about them here. But that's a personal, it's a personal decision, I guess, or ethic, if you will.
Yeah, I understand your point, but let me point this to you, pose this to you. We're concerned these days about the barred owl that's preying on the spotted owl. But that's a new species that's coming into this area. Should we expect the barred owl to continue forever? And would we want to protect the barred owl over a long period of time? I mean, I think it's a very complex discussion that we're having here. I don't think it's straightforward at all, actually.
Yeah, I mean, my answer would be the barred owl is here because of human actions that promoted its dispersion into the habitat of the spotted owl, from which it was naturally separated by, vegetation and climate conditions. So we're responsible for the invasion of the barred owl, and thereby have a measure of responsibility for the effects that the barred owl is having on the spotted owl.
Thanks. I take your point. Very, very good points. Thank you, Dan.
Okay.
Very good response.
No, thanks for the question.
Appreciate
Great
that. Thank
question.
you.
Appreciate it.
All right, we have another question here in the chat box, and this one is from Linda. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce the last name, but she asks, which state office would be the best contact for citizen scientists concerning this issue?
In terms of, I guess, advocacy, I would say the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. They have responsibility. They have identified it as a state species of special concern, meaning that it may qualify for listing status. When they prepared that designation, they promised that they would monitor the birds regularly to determine changes in status. That hasn't been accomplished. So, focusing on the need to even understand the basics of how the species is doing would be something that I think could be directed at the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, has more national focus, and they seem to be more in the area of, oh, it's a species, it's doing well elsewhere. We have lots of other things to do, and we're not going to wade in. Advocating with Audubon would be to raise the profile that they make toward the species, like California Audubon, I think would be helpful. I've tried to do that, and they've been helpful to some degree, but it's not really a marquee species. And in part, that's because of where it lives. People want, when you protect the purple martin, you're not really protecting anything else. Because the habitat requirements are so unique, and a lot of the sites are so urbanized. I mean, that doesn't apply in all areas, I guess. If you're protecting snags in forests, you're protecting other species. But, a lot of the focus is going in on either higher profile species or species that are indicators of ecosystems that support larger numbers of species. So there are reasons why they aren't doing as much. I'm sorry, let me just say one last thing. If you're talking about citizen science in terms of helping, the agencies are not doing anything. I mean, it's just that simple. So if you want to go and get data to help people like me and others, hopefully in the future, that will take that data and do something with it, then I would say going to sites and doing counts and recording them in eBird is probably the best citizen science activity that you could do.
All right, well, thank you, Dan. Okay, well, it is 8:15, and I'm not seeing any other questions. So I'm going to go ahead and just wind this down. So thank you again, Dan, for the absolutely excellent presentation. And thank you to everyone who attended. We certainly appreciate it. I just want to take a quick moment to remind all of you that Fresno Audubon is on social media, and it's great to follow us there to stay in the loop with different events that we have coming up. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as well. We also have our YouTube channel, and that's great to check out if you've missed any of our recent general meetings. We have all those recordings up there. So if you wanted to rewatch this one or any general meeting from recent months, definitely check out our YouTube channel. We do hope that you'll join us for next month's general meeting, which is scheduled for November 8th. And Homer Hansen will be talking to us about flycatchers. So stay tuned for an announcement and links to registration for that event. And with that, we will go ahead and sign off. So have a great remainder of your week and stay safe out there. Good night, everybody. Thank you again, Dan.
Thank you, Rachel. Great job. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.